Sometimes a story from history gets popular because it's funny, or because it makes us feel represented, or because it's mysterious. But sometimes something happens that is so important, that has so many knock-on effects that follow in its wake for centuries afterwards, that you just have to know about it. This is what the dissolution of the monasteries is in English history. No matter how much you hate Henry VIII, he elbows his way into every conversation about the past 500 years. If you point at something in this country and ask, why is it like that? 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 Chances are that at least part of the answer will be because of Henry VIII. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to trace the history of the dissolution of the monasteries from its beginnings through to how one petty man 500 years ago made his marriage breakdown everyone's problem, including yours. It's hard for us to imagine how powerful the Catholic Church is in the 1500s in England. Firstly, they just own a good deal of it. I've often heard people say that the Church owned a third of England before the Reformation, but I've never found a good source on that, so let's just say they owned a lot. One of the most powerful monasteries in the country was Barking Abbey, who owned entire villages all over Essex. Your bishop might be your landlord. And although individual monks aren't supposed to own anything, monasteries themselves might be extremely wealthy, and the Bishop of London or the Prior of the Charterhouse is considered on the same level as the nobility, God's princes. With their monopoly on baptisms, weddings and funerals, they literally control birth, marriage and death. If a priest commits a crime, he doesn't go through the same justice system as you. He gets to go to a special court that the church runs itself, and they don't have as harsh punishments. And they do good works. It's churchmen and nuns running your local hospital and your school and making sure you get into the good afterlife. But that also makes them easy to resent. When church officials are found to be corrupt, doesn't it just have that extra sting because they're supposed to be above that sort of thing? Because they hold over you not just the power of life and death, but of eternal life and eternal damnation? The stakes cannot be higher. So well before Henry VIII comes along, there are people who have criticisms of the church. In the 14th century, a Yorkshire man called John Wycliffe argued that the church should give up all its property and members of the clergy should live within humble means. He especially didn't like the church practice of indulgences. Under the Catholicism of the day, when you die, only the very best people go to heaven and the worst to hell. Everyone else, your average person, goes to a middle place called purgatory, where they have to earn their place in heaven, either by people on earth praying for them, or by enduring torture. Whenever the church needed money, they would sell these certificates promising you or your loved ones time off in purgatory for the good deed of funding the church. You don't want your dead mum to be tortured in the afterlife, right? Better spend all your money on my very official bit of paper. It's a scam that preys upon the grieving and the frightened, and even at the time, people like John Wycliffe were calling it out. In fact, Wycliffe didn't believe in purgatory at all. He also rejected a lot of the other trappings of the medieval Catholic Church, like saints and pilgrimages and monasteries. Wycliffe called friars full of pride, covetousness, simony and false robbery. He was out here calling for the dissolution of the monasteries 200 years before any king tried it. He and his followers even try translating the Bible into English so that ordinary people can read it and decide for themselves what God wants, rather than relying on a priest. As you might expect, this makes him some very powerful enemies. He's condemned by the Pope, he's summoned before bishops to explain himself, but he gains followers, known as Lollards. We don't know why. Who are fiercely persecuted by the state. This is why kings start burning people for heresy, to get rid of the Lollards specifically. Lambeth Palace on the South Bank still has a tower famous for imprisoning Lollards in. But the Lollards are about to get a boost from a monk in Germany called Martin Luther. Martin Luther is a German law student who gets struck by lightning one day and reevaluates all his life choices, which seems like a reasonable response to being struck by lightning, to be honest. He becomes a monk at Wittenberg, but like John Wycliffe, he becomes convinced that the church is on the wrong path. And in 1517, he writes his famous call-out post, the 95 Theses, arguing against indulgences and other church practices. Throughout his life, he becomes more radical, arguing that you don't need all these bishops and cardinals and sacraments to go to heaven. You just need to read the Bible for yourself. A lot of his ideas were similar to Wycliffe's, but Luther has the benefit of the printing press, so they get distributed a lot more widely. At first, Luther's ideas are persecuted just like Wycliffe's were. Henry VIII bans his books in 1520, and after that, English Lutherans have to smuggle them in. The king also writes a defence of the sacraments, which impresses the Pope so much that he awards him the title Defender of the Faith. I'm swirling around the irony like a fine communion wine. He's going to have to give up that title later on when he falls out with the Catholic. They're still using it! And it's not just Luther. In 1526, an Englishman living in Germany called William Tyndale translates the New Testament into English. The Bishop of London hated this thing so much that he bought all the copies and did an actual book burning in front of the cathedral. Except that meant that the first print run sold out, so they had enough money to do a second printing. The Barbara Streisand effect was alive and well in the 1520s. Tyndale spends the rest of his life fleeing the authorities and was eventually burned at the stake in the Netherlands. At the same time, Henry is not doing great. By the time Tyndale's Bible has come out, he's been married to his wife, the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, for 17 years. And although the marriage started out very happy, the couple have buried 5 children, leaving only one child, a girl called Mary. Catherine hasn't been pregnant for 8 years, and they've stopped sleeping together. The same year Tyndale's Bible is published, Henry names an entire warship after his mistress, Catherine's own lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. I've done a whole separate video about Anne that you can see here. Henry wanted a son very badly. This isn't just for misogyny reasons, although, you know. But England had only ever had one woman even try to take the throne herself before, Queen Matilda, and it had led to civil war. And England had only just come out of a generations-long civil war that had left Henry's dad on top. And Henry knew that it wasn't safe to put all your eggs in one kid, because he himself was only king because his older brother had died. By 1525, he is actively trying to find ways out of his marriage. The problem is that Henry and Catherine's marriage had been personally blessed by the Pope at the time. You see, Henry was Catherine's second husband. She originally came to England to marry that older brother of his, Arthur, who died very shortly after the wedding. In the Bible, it says that you're not supposed to marry your brother's widow, Leviticus 20:21, and if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. So when Henry married Catherine instead, they had to get special permission from the Pope at the time to do it. But now Henry's using that Bible line to claim that he never should have been married to Catherine in the first place. God must be punishing him. That's why he can't have a son. In 1527, he tells Catherine that he does not believe they are lawfully man and wife, and starts trying to persuade the Pope to cancel or annul the marriage. This is important. We often talk about Henry's breakup as a divorce, but it wasn't. That's just a word we use to get across the concept quickly to modern ears. Sometimes people ask me, if the whole point of the Church of England was to get a divorce, why couldn't normal people get a divorce until the 19th century? The point of the Church of England was never to make divorce legal. Henry VIII never got divorced. That's not the word anyone uses at the time. He got an annulment, meaning the marriage was never legal in the first place. And the Catholic Church has always had annulments, for good reason. If you get married and then later find out that your husband is actually your twin brother from whom you got separated at birth, then even the Catholic Church would agree that you shouldn't stay married. And that sounds like a crazy thing that would never happen, but over 1,000 years of history, it's gonna happen at some point. If someone kidnaps a wealthy 8-year-old child and marries them for their inheritance, that's not legal, and the Church needs a way of cancelling it. Henry doesn't argue that his marriage has irretrievably broken down. He argues that the marriage was never legal in the first place. Whether you think that's right or wrong, that's what he was asking the Pope to give him. Now, this was never going to happen, not because Catholics are against divorce. Very rich people could get spurious annulments if they greased the wheels a little bit, but because Catherine had friends in high places. She was a princess in her own right, and her nephew was the actual Holy Roman Emperor. There's no way that the Pope was going to risk upsetting him. But he couldn't tell Henry no to his face either, so instead he plays for time, indefinitely. By 1530, Henry's had enough. Wait a minute, I'm the king! Some guy in Rome can't tell me what to do. And he charges every clergyman in the country with a crime called praemunire, which essentially he's just made up, but means following the Pope before the king, basically. He passes the Act in Restraint of Appeals, which says that the Church can't run their cases overseas. He wants legal cases to be decided on English soil, not for churchmen to go off to Rome or Paris to get their cases decided. He declares himself the supreme head of the Church in England, and he grants himself the annulment, leaving him free to marry Anne Boleyn instead. Every adult in the country is forced to swear that Henry's children by Anne will inherit the throne over Mary, his daughter with Catherine. Calling Henry a tyrant becomes treason, punishable by being hanged, drawn and quartered. That's why I take great delight in saying what my ancestors couldn't. Henry was a tyrant. Tyrant, tyrant, tyrant. Over the next 6 years, 200 people are executed for treason. In the meantime, Henry starts an investigation into the Church's finances. He finds huge amounts of corruption and crime. And look, I'm not saying there wasn't any, but Henry wasn't bothered about this until 5 minutes ago, when he suddenly got a big incentive to find as much crime as possible. And in 1536, he starts closing monasteries. At first, it's just the small ones, the ones that can't fight back, and then more and more until they're all gone. When a monastery is closed or dissolved, then workers are sent to strip it for parts. They take the bells, the lead off the roof, the gold and jewels, and the grain in their barns. Once everything's been gutted, a lot of London is in ruins. The church was one of the biggest landowners, and all this land comes onto the market at once. There's so many empty buildings that we don't know what to do with them. Church outbuildings are converted into carpenters' shops and slum houses and warehouses. Part of what is now Southwark Cathedral was let out to a baker who kept pigs and a dung heap in the retro choir. Altars are turned into gambling tables, and church buildings are turned into pigsties and wrestling arenas. Pages from books are used to clean shoes or even as toilet paper. One of Henry's commissioners said that the works of the monk John Duns Scotus were nailed up on posts in all common houses of easement. As for the monks and nuns themselves, they mostly get given pensions and told, go home, get a real job. Now, these are people whose job it is to think about religion all day, so a few of them are reformers themselves. The monk John Hooper from Cleeve Monastery in Somerset becomes a full-on Lutheran and actually ends up being burned at the stake for being too Protestant. But some monks try to fight back. They refuse to acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. They refuse to dissolve. The priors at Axham, Beauvale, London Charterhouse, Guisborough, Colchester, and Whalley are all executed for treason. And just because the king says you can't stay in your monastery anymore doesn't mean that you believe your vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity are null and void. If you are a nun, it's going to be hard for you to make your way in the world as an unmarried woman. And if you're the kind of nun who's there because her family wanted to get you out of the way, oh boy. A few people try carrying on living as monks and nuns. The abbess of Denny Abbey went back home, but according to family legend, she and 2 or 3 other nuns carried on wearing their habits and followed the rules of their order for the rest of their lives. As for ordinary people, they had all sorts of reactions. Even amongst people with orthodox beliefs, a lot of people thought that the clergy were corrupt and sinful, just the same as you might vote for a political party, but when you're in the pub talking politics, then it's, they're all in for themselves, aren't they? Of course, people are afraid of being punished for speaking up. In the summer of 1533, 2 women are stripped, beaten, and their ears nailed to posts for saying that Catherine was the true queen. But also, there is no such thing as democracy back then. You don't get a vote on this. If you're a peasant, probably no one has ever asked you your opinion on politics or religion your whole life. It's not up to you to form an opinion. In one manuscript written a few decades afterwards, the writer says that his dad was one of the workers pulling down Roche Abbey, and he asked him, "Why did you do it? Didn't the monks do a good job of looking after your soul?" And his dad says that he didn't have anything against the monks, but might I, not as well as others, have some profit from the spoil of the abbey? For I saw all would away, and therefore I did as others did. But some people do rebel. Some workmen who are pulling down abbeys are attacked by the locals. In Lincolnshire, tens of thousands of people march on Lincoln against the putting down of their monasteries, and the Chancellor of Lincoln is killed. In Yorkshire, the lawyer Robert Aske leads 20,000 through the gates of York to escort monks back to their old homes and to petition the king to restore the monasteries, in what was called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry meets Aske and pretends to totally agree with him, even gives him a hug, and then he goes scorched earth on Yorkshire, hanging people in their own homes across the county. Aske himself was hanged in York the next year. But with apologies to the county of Yorkshire, who cares? This sounds like a bust-up that happened 500 years ago to people who wore codpieces and said things like zoons unironically. But what if I told you that because of this one guy, you talk differently, you watch different movies, your town looks different, that your whole life grew from the ribcage of a dead abbey? All over the country, there are the ruins of abbeys and monasteries that once controlled a huge amount of land and wealth. Some of them, like Lesner's Abbey, have been left as ruins, but many more have been totally scrubbed off the map. In London, there was a religious house where Liverpool Street Station is. There was one at St James's Palace, Blackfriars, Kilburn, St Giles in the Fields, Shoreditch, Bermondsey, Clerkenwell, Greenwich. There were so many. Some monasteries Henry keeps for himself and turns into palaces and hunting grounds. Something people often don't realise about Henry is that he was a huge builder of palaces. By the time he dies, he has over 50 palaces around the country, more than any other monarch before or since. And some of those are built on the bones of old monasteries. In London, he builds Nonsuch House on top of Merton Priory and St James's Palace on top of an old leper hospital run by monks. St James's is still considered the most senior palace in the country. When we get a new monarch, it is announced at St James's first. He also seizes Hampton Court and Whitehall, which were the private homes of a cardinal. Whitehall was huge, bigger than the Vatican, which I'll remind you is an entire country. And Hampton Court is unbelievably grand. When Henry doesn't take a monastery over, he still strips it for parts. 25 tonnes of lead is taken off the roof of St Mary's Priory in Spitalfields and used to repair the roof of Westminster Hall in the modern-day Houses of Parliament. So there's this transfer of wealth from the church to the state. It fills up Henry's coffers and he's able to spend that money on building new palaces and war with Scotland and France. And it's not just Henry that gets a cut. He keeps some of this land for himself and he sells off some to his mates. The whole aristocracy get a bonanza when the monasteries are dissolved. A lot of stately homes are built on the grounds of old monasteries. The Duke of Suffolk alone buys up 30 old monasteries. Ever wondered why Downton Abbey is called an abbey when it's clearly, a house? This is why. In London, the Charterhouse Priory gets sold off to Sir Edward North and then bought by the Duke of Norfolk, who makes it his London home. And if you walk around the Charterhouse today, it's like a Tudor mansion has been slammed down on top of a monastery. You'll be walking through these old medieval corridors where the monks used to sit in their cells and read the Bible. And then bam, there's a great hall or a great chamber with coats of arms and gold on the ceiling. Eastbury Manor House is built on land that used to belong to Barking Abbey. Sion House used to be Sion Abbey. The bones of dead monasteries become fertiliser for mansions and palaces to spring up. Am I doing another video about death? Well, history is the study of the dead. If you point to a random stately home in this country and ask, why is it there? Then the answer might be, because there used to be a monastery there. The churches that get left behind are changed too. The church that gets the biggest trashing has to be Canterbury Cathedral, which had a shrine to its own homegrown saint, my boy, true Cockney, my problematic fave, Thomas Becket. My very first video ever was about Thomas Becket back in 2017. Oh, I didn't realise you'd been doing videos for that long. YouTube only started showing me your stuff in 2023. I know it did. Becket was a real-life Archbishop of Canterbury who defied the king of his day and was killed for it. After his death, his became the single most popular shrine in the country. It was covered in gold and jewels from all the pilgrims who'd left donations for him. Henry hated the idea of an English saint who represented the church triumphing over the king. When workers are sent to strip Becket's shrine, it takes 26 wagons to cart all the goods back to London. And he hires a painter specifically to go around defacing pictures of Becket. And he charges the saint, a man who's been dead for 350 years, with treason. It's not just gems and treasure. Reformers don't believe in praying to saints or relics, so those are taken down or destroyed. Later monarchs go even further. Churches used to have paintings on the walls. They're all whitewashed over. No more rosaries, processions, saints' days, stone altars, incense, gold chalices, altar cloths, banners, tapestries, even candles are a bit iffy for a while. The Anglican Church has loosened up on this stuff since the 19th century, so these days your church might well have some of these things that they've brought back in. But if you go to a Catholic church on the continent, it's way more colourful than your typical English church, because this never happened over there. So they still have all their old gold relics and mosaics. Nowadays, if an English church managed to keep any of its saints' images or wall paintings, they're really proud of them, and that'll be like a tourist attraction. But originally, all the churches would have had this stuff. And churches that are built new after the Reformation are built from the ground up to look Protestant. In London, there was a great fire in 1666, a video on that here, which burned down 80 churches. And when they were rebuilt plain white, with no stained glass. Colour is Catholic. In Italy and France at the time, they were having a Baroque movement in art and architecture, all about high drama and big splashy effects. The English version of Baroque had to be monochrome because having too much colour was beyond the pale. Even putting a dome on St Paul's Cathedral was controversial because it reminds us of the dome on the Pantheon in Rome. And we're not meant to be taking ideas from those barbarous papists. And meanwhile, there are so many abandoned ruins all over the country that you've probably got one close to you. There are at least 4 within an hour's drive of me, and you visit them and you feel the sense of death of a once thriving culture now in decay. And you start writing books about it, and suddenly you've got a literary movement on your hands. And you name it after the style of architecture these ruins are built in, which is called Gothic. And so Goths are only called that because of Henry VIII. One thing Henry spends all that money on is war, and war is coming. In 1537, the Pope publishes a decree that Henry should not be allowed a Christian burial, that everyone in England is complicit in his crime, that English marriages are invalid, true sons of the church are forbidden from trade or communication with England. This means that if you're a Catholic king, war with England is fair game. There is war with France between 1543 and 1546, and the Scots are allies with the French, so there's war with them in 1542 and again in 1545 to 1551. So Henry takes that lovely monastery money and builds forts all down the coast, 30 of them, in places like Deal and Tilbury and Pendennis. So if you live near one of those places and you ask, what's that massive great thing doing there? Then the answer is the dissolution of the monasteries. There's a war with Scotland where Henry orders his commander to put all to fire and sword, burn Edinburgh town, so razed and defaced when you have sacked and gotten what you can of it, as there may remain forever a perpetual memory of the vengeance of God lighted upon them for their falsehood and disloyalty. And because of that war, baby Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent to France to marry their heir to the throne rather than an English noble. That means that she's raised Catholic, and by the time she grows up, England's still got a Protestant monarch, Elizabeth I, and wouldn't it be very convenient for Catholics if she dropped dead and we put this lovely Scottish woman on the throne instead? So Elizabeth gets really paranoid, semi-justifiably, about Catholics trying to kill her, and she makes harsher and harsher laws against them. People are executed in the worst ways it is possible to die because of this. And as she becomes harder on Catholics, that just gives Catholics even more incentive to bump her off. 200 Catholics are executed during her reign, by the end of which there's at least one assassination attempt on her every year. By the time she dies, an old lady in her bed in 1603, English people just associate Catholics with treason. And it's a Catholic plot that Guy Fawkes gets tangled up in when he tries to blow up Parliament, meaning we set off fireworks on the 5th of November every year because of Henry VIII. And that's not even getting into all the other Catholic Protestant violence that happens in Britain over the next couple of centuries. The English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the Jacobites, the Gordon riots, anti-Irish prejudice. To this day, the monarch is not allowed to have ever been Catholic. If you're a Muslim or a Hindu, you can convert to the Church of England and become king, but if you've ever been a Catholic, you are perma-banned. And Henry had already built up the English navy back in the 1510s, but because of war with France, there was reason to keep a lot of ships around even in peacetime, just in case. In 1545, the French sends an invasion force, and during the battle to fend them off, the ship called the Mary Rose sinks north of the Isle of Wight. It was recovered back in the 1980s, complete with the sailors' shoes and musical instruments and their dog on board, and the ship is now a museum in Portsmouth. So if you live in Portsmouth and you're like, why is that ship there? The answer is, because of the dissolution of the monasteries. If Henry VIII hadn't wanted to leave his wife, that dog would have lived. And it's that inflated navy that Queen Elizabeth I uses to defend England against the Spanish Armada in 1588, winning a famous victory that was great for the English Navy's propaganda. And the extra shipbuilding and cannon building yards that Henry built create the same ships that sail to the Americas to begin the colonies that will become the very first British Empire. In a very real sense, Henry VIII is the reason we have the musical Hamilton. So Henry gets all this money from dissolving the monasteries, but he also gets new powers. The church used to run its own court that would deal with A, crimes committed by priests, and B, stuff that wasn't illegal but was a sin, so like adultery, missing church, getting too drunk, that sort of thing. The state takes over all of that. Under future monarchs, missing church will become punishable by a fine. Henry VIII was looking for ways to get rid of priests, and then as now, if you accuse priests of sex crimes, a lot of people will go, yeah, I always figured they were up to something. So in 1533, Henry takes some of these acts that were looked after by the church courts and makes them crimes dealt with by the secular courts, which answer to him. He passes the Buggery Act, which criminalises unorthodox sex, some of which we would still consider illegal today, like bestiality, but some we wouldn't, like sex between men. He doesn't carry over, say, the church's prohibition on sleeping with women who aren't your wife. Henry, I cannot stress this enough, being gay was only made illegal because of the dissolution of the monasteries. Before Henry VIII came along, theatre would be organised by monks. They'd do these Bible-based plays called miracle plays or mystery plays, and some cities like York and Chester still do theirs. But after the dissolution of the monasteries, monks weren't putting on plays anymore, so plays became more secular instead, and people start writing their own plays about ancient Rome and British history and contemporary Italy, and bam, now you've got Shakespeare. Shakespeare was able to leave his job in his dad's glove shop and start writing plays because of the dissolution of the monasteries. And a lot of British actors got their start in Shakespeare companies. That's why they talk like that. Ian McKellen, The Dench, Patrick Stewart, David Tennant, Ray Fiennes, Maggie Smith, Gary Oldman. If English theatre had taken off in the 1880s and not the 1580s, then the plays that these actors started out with would have had completely different language, and so their acting would be different. If you like the films these actors are in, then they talk like that because of Henry VIII. And it's not just the theatre, it's your school and your hospital. Without any monks to do that, education has to be taken over by private entities and also by the monarch. There are a lot of schools named after Henry VIII's kids, a lot of King Edward VI grammar schools and Queen Elizabeth high schools, because they had to reopen all these closed down monastery schools. Bart's Hospital in Smithfield has a statue of Henry VIII over the gate because, unlike a lot of hospitals, he allowed this one to reopen. And because hospitals aren't being run by monks anymore, they start being run by, like, actual doctors. Not only are they more familiar with the scientific method, but they're allowed to do things that monks aren't, like dissecting bodies to find out how they work. Bart's Hospital will go on to produce William Harvey, who dissects corpses and figures out that blood is pumped around the body by the heart rather than just sort of sitting there. And he wouldn't have figured that out if it weren't for the dissolution of the monasteries. And under Protestantism, there's a lot of importance placed on education because you have to be able to read the Bible for yourself, so you need to be able to read. That thing William Tyndale was burned at the stake for 5 minutes ago is now mandatory. Under the new rules, your local church had to have a copy of the Bible in English available for you to read. So even if you couldn't afford a book yourself, now there is one written in your own language that you've got access to. So literacy starts rising. And the church has to keep a record of weddings, christenings and burials. The parish register has been in use ever since and is invaluable for historians. And even if you haven't personally read the Bible, you talk as if you have. The first major English Bibles, the Tyndale Bible and the King James, have a huge effect on the English language. We often talk about how many new turns of phrase that, say, Shakespeare contributed to the English language,
But the Bible is just one book, man. He that is not with me is against me, slow to anger, the apple of his eye, the blind leading the blind, bottomless pit, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, turn the other cheek, my cup runneth over, the valley of the shadow of death, the four corners of the earth, give up the ghost, a house divided against itself shall not stand. There are so many. The way we talk in church changes. Of course, the services are in English now rather than in Latin. But it's more than that. In 1549, the Book of Common Prayer is approved, which gives your priest all the words that he's supposed to say in the different services, and is still in use today. So things like wedding vows are different because of the dissolution of the monasteries. Brides used to promise to be bonner and buxom in bed and board. After 1549, they used the words we're familiar with now: for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And the whole story is such good drama that it keeps being made into movies and TV shows. The film The Private Life of Henry VIII was a huge boost to the career of actor Charles Laughton, who won an Oscar for the portrayal. Laughton then went on to have a Hollywood career off the back of this movie, including playing Quasimodo in 1939's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which was the main inspiration for Disney's Hunchback in the 90s.
I don't know if you can hear me, or if you're even there.
So we have Hellfire, the best Disney villain song, because of Henry VIII. Another actor who got his break in Tudor period dramas is Henry Cavill. If Henry VIII hadn't been so messy, then his life would never have been made into the Tudors, and Henry Cavill would never have played the Duke of Suffolk, and he would never have been Superman, and he never would have had to grow a moustache for Mission Impossible 6, forcing reshoots for the Justice League movie to give him a fake upper lip with CGI, which was so widely panned online that there was a petition with hundreds of thousands of signatures for the director to release his own cut of the movie. So Henry VIII is the reason we have the Snyder Cut.
Thank you for watching! I filmed part of this video at one of London's actual abbey ruins, Lesners Abbey in Bexley Heath, and this is something I'd like to do more often. I'd like to take videos out of this tiny living room and go and film actual locations. The problem is, I don't have a lot of access to cool places in London, or at least not when it's quiet. I had to get up at 5 in the morning to do my hair before driving out to Lesners Abbey when it would be quiet. Not that it helped.
Oh! That is the woman in Harry Potter! This is the woman in Harry Potter!
So this is the third time I've come out to the Abbey to try and film this section. There is a 3-hour gap in the rain today, and on one side of the park there's a lawnmower, and on the other there's some construction going on. So you're going to get the sound you get in this video.
So if you have access to a cool London location that I can come and film in, I would love to hear about it. Maybe you work at a stately home, or a place of worship, or a theatre, or a museum, or part of London's transport network, and you can get me in to film there. Maybe you have a cool object in storage that would look really good on camera. I can't promise everything will be a good fit for the channel, but I would love to hear from you through the contact form on my website, jdraper.co.uk. You can also come and see me in person. I'm going to be speaking on a panel at the Chelsea History Festival about London archaeology, along with 3 other amazing historians on the 27th of September. You can get tickets for that in the description. Thank you very much.